Hello, and welcome to the Merri-Cast, the show that puts you on the fast track to business confidence. My guest this week is the incredible Bob Quick. It's difficult to do justice to Bob in such a short period of time. He's unique among our guests in terms of his background because prior to becoming an entrepreneur, he was in the police service. He was a raw Bobby on the beat in Lambeth, but then he rose quickly through the ranks and he just kept on going and going and going. He became Chief Constable for Surrey, and then Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations. That's kind of counter-terrorism to you and me, and he kept us all safe, basically. Bob's experiences in the police alone would be worth at least another podcast or two, but to me it's what he did next that is at least as impressive. For Bob crossed the Rubicon from policing into the business world. This was a major challenge, and it's difficult to imagine two worlds more different, one by definition, full of rules, and the other with license to roam. Now, Bob succeeded because he now sits atop two thriving businesses, BGS and Global Secure Accreditation. The latter is now providing security accreditation and assurance for hotels. But the story is all about how Bob adjusted and what mistakes he made and the resilience he showed before coming out on top to succeed in an entirely different world. All of it's here in this interview, and we join him here as he explains why young Bob joined the police in the first place.
But my father had been a special constable police officer at Chelsea, actually, where he stayed for about 30 years serving as a volunteer and became an inspector. And he was always immensely enthusiastic about the police and loved volunteering. So that was really a big influence on me about whether I chose a police career. I must say I wasn't entirely keen on the idea, but my father was very keen I gave it a try. And so aged 18, I joined the Metropolitan Police in London. And after my basic training, I was dropped into Lambeth. So there I was, this 18-year-old from Surrey, who'd had a fairly sheltered upbringing, dropped into this metropolis, and not only that, into one of the hardest boroughs in London. And it was a baptism of fire. And I have to say, I hated it to begin with. My first few months of training and the discipline and the regimental sort of nature of policing, I found quite uncomfortable. And it took me a while to fit in. But I have to say, within a year, I was reveling in it. I absolutely loved it. It was exciting. Every day was different. Every day you were left with stories to tell people about what had happened. And I was learning a great deal from very wise older police officers, a lot of ex-military people in those days in the police. Who were very wise mentors to young police officers like myself, and that was extremely valuable. And my career sort of moved on from there.
And was that a gradual process then, or was there a moment where you thought, yeah, actually, I hated this to start with, but today I love it? Was there a moment where something happened and you thought, yes, I've arrived?
I think there was actually. I ended up first being posted to Kennington Police Station, which covers the top end or north end of Brixton and Waterloo and all those sort of areas, Vauxhall. So quite a tough area, quite a lot of deprivation. And I think probably after my first year of my probation, just everything seemed to click. I'd made some really good friends in the police service. People my own age, other probationary officers. I'd kind of latched on to people that I thought were good mentors for me, people that I really respected, and I could observe them and the way they did their job. I used to think, I want to be like that person. You know, I like the way they operate, and they invested time in me. And suddenly it just all clicked. And I would say there was a big turnaround within a year. I thought, actually, this is the career for me, and I now understand it. I understand what being a police officer is all about, and how many options I've got going forward in my career, which actually proved to be the case. And I've often described policing as 1,000 careers in one. because there are so many specialisms and so many career paths that you can pursue.
So maybe tell us a little bit about then. I mean, you rose quickly, through the police service, but maybe just a brief sort of sketch on some of those roles that you did, which ended up with an extremely sort of senior role in the MAP.
Yeah.
So.
Well, very early in my career, I decided I want to become a traffic police officer and ride motorcycles for a living because I liked and always have liked motorcycles. But again, just one pivotal moment, one evening in Brixton, I observed some suspicious characters throwing some stuff over a wall. And in fact, what had happened, they'd burgled a wine warehouse where very valuable wines were kept. And I called for assistance, and we swept up this little gang of burglars. And we went back to the police station, and this wizened old detective sergeant obviously took a bit of a shine to me and liked the job that I'd done, and said to me, how much service you've got. I had about 18 months then, and he said, well, look, what are you going to do with your career? And I said, I'm going to join the traffic police. At which point he spat his tea across the room and said, absolutely not. You can't go and join the traffic police. You need to join the CID. And he insisted I put in an application to become a trainee detective. And that set me on a 30-year career, really, of being a detective. And I ended up serving on many tough London divisions: Brixton, Peckham, Catford, Woolwich, which probably said a lot about what the Met Police thought of me, sending me to all these rough areas. But I met so many great people in the community and other police officers, and I took promotion quite early, became a detective sergeant. I served on quite a lot of different squads: drug squads, robbery squads, murder squads. So I had a fantastic foundation over a number of years, working really at the sharp end, dealing with really serious crime. I eventually became a detective, and then detective constable, detective sergeant, detective inspector, and I served for many years in those ranks in an operational setting, mainly dealing with violent crime and criminals. Then I moved into the world of counter-corruption. But my promotion meant that at key times I went back as a uniform officer, serving as a uniform police superintendent, for example, at Peckham, where I was the deputy in command of that division. So I had this opportunity to go back into uniform roles, which keeps you in touch with, what the rest of the police service are doing. But my specialism and my career path was as a detective. And then in the late 90s, I went into the world of anti-corruption. And that was a revelation to me, because at the time the Metropolitan Police was experiencing quite serious episodes of corruption, which of course has echoes of today now, of course, where the police service reputation is in some disrepute due to conduct of some officers, a very small minority, I suspect. But I spent 2 years in the anti-corruption world, and then the commissioner summoned me to support the Metropolitan Police through the Lawrence inquiry, which was a very difficult time for the police service, where it had to face some significant realities about the way the world had changed and the way society was changing and the way policing had to change. And so I became involved in some of the developmental work that came as a consequence of the Macpherson public inquiry, and that brought a lot of change to policing. And then after that, I was appointed commander at territorial policing with the crime portfolio. So that was a very big role, where I had sort of responsibility for crime across the 32 boroughs of London. And that was a exciting role. And as a result of that, at the time, crime was pretty high. There was a lot of violent crime, knife crime, and I had the privilege of developing and leading an operation called Safer Streets. This was in the early 2000s, and that really proved to be a very effective operation involving literally thousands of officers deployed on the streets of London in a very proactive way to take on street robbers, gun crime, and other violent crime head on. And I think that was in the days when the police, had the manpower to field proactively against that type of crime. I think it struggles to do that now. But we managed to reduce in the first year violent crime and robbery by about 25%, and that carried on for successive years. I handed that operation over to my successor, and they continued in that vein. And then I applied to become the Deputy Chief Constable of Surrey, which was my home force, and I was successful and was appointed Deputy Chief Constable, and then soon after appointed Chief Constable of Surrey, which was a wonderful experience coming out of the metropolis, which was, a very complex, large organisation, into a much smaller organisation of about just under 5,000 staff, but with its own challenges. Surrey Police were, really struggled with resources. It had a population in Surrey at that time about 1.2 million, and pockets of severe deprivation. A lot of predatory criminals coming out of London to target Surrey homes and locations in Surrey. So we had our own challenges there, and it was a great experience. And at the end of my career, after serving as Chief Constable, I returned to London as Assistant Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, and I had the wonderful experience of being appointed Assistant Commissioner Specialist Operations. So I had the national counter-terrorism responsibility for policing, which means working very closely with the security services. There are dedicated police resources across the UK that are dedicated to fighting terrorism, and the job also had responsibility for the protection of the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers, the protection of the Queen and the royal family wherever they travelled in the world, embassies and visiting heads of state. So I think my last major operation was the visit by President Obama to the United Kingdom state visit, his first visit, and then the G20 economic conference in London in 2008, 2009.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost something I feel like I should pause there, because there's so much in there that, in terms of everything that you've done, and it makes you quite unlike any guest that we've had on this podcast debate, because there's such an array of experience, and in terms of sort of managing teams, large teams, dealing with difficult situations. I can see, because this is obviously a podcast about entrepreneurs, that there are some things that you will have learned in the process of that would have put you in good stead for a life as an entrepreneur, but also maybe some things that perhaps you maybe had to unlearn along the way, and so on. So let's think about this Rubicon moment where you were leaving the police service after a long and distinguished career and moving into the world as I know you did, sort of in terms of being an entrepreneur. Could you just take me through that, crossing the Rubicon, the moment, with how you approached being that, about what your expectations were as you were making that leap?
Well, absolutely. I think it was a very challenging time, because leaving the police service, where in many ways you are institutionalized, coming out into the commercial world was a big change and transition for me. And it was quite a shock. And I found it much more difficult than I thought. I like to think I was quite an entrepreneurial police officer. I was very much an advocate of police reform, police modernisation. I had the national portfolio for the police workforce and was very keen on, workforce reform issues. So when I left the police service, I thought I would be reasonably well equipped for entrepreneurial life and commercial life. But actually, I soon found I had major gaps in my experience and knowledge and skills to operate successfully in the commercial world. So I learned a lot of tough lessons in the years after my retirement from policing. And, I had quite a lot of knocks and falls and just had to pick myself up, dust myself down. And I realized I was running around really, as an entrepreneur with L plates. I just didn't really fully understand how the entrepreneurial world worked, the commercial world. The values systems were often different. The way customers and clients saw value was not necessarily what I thought it was. So, part of the challenge was really rewiring my brain into this world and thinking differently and thinking from the customer's point of view, about what was valuable to them. And it wasn't always what I thought was valuable to them. So really understanding their problems, because and there were parallels with policing in that sense, understanding communities and what worries them, what frightens them, what's harming them. So in that regard, I think that helped. But it was a long lesson that I had to endure.
So I mean, that's interesting about what you're saying about rewiring the brain. We'll get into that in just a sec. Let's have a little bit of context though. So the first firm that you sort of set up was called what?
I set up a company called Blue Light Global Solutions, which was in effect a security advisory company, which is still going strong today and is very active. And initially, my hope was that company would get involved in supporting police forces in modernisation and reform. But again, when you're inside an organisation looking out, the world is very different to what it is when you're on the outside looking in. And this is what I found almost immediately, how difficult it was to deal with the police as a customer and how infuriating it was. And, I only hope I wasn't as infuriating when I was a police officer and a chief constable, when dealing with commercial firms, but I suspect I probably was. So I ended up developing a lot of sympathy for companies that were trying to serve the police and trying to do business with the police and other government sort of sectors as well. So in the end, we were successful with some contracts, but very quickly I realized actually the overseas market was much more receptive. The police in the UK are quite a devolved organisation. There were 43 police forces at that time, and just in England and Wales, and each with their own governance systems, and their own cultures and their own priorities. So it was very difficult to deal with. Whereas the British sort of brand of policing expertise and knowledge was valued abroad. Perhaps more than it is here, actually.
Yeah.
And we were quite successful in delivering consulting projects, training programs with overseas police forces and other security-related organisations. And then really the company just evolved from there. But I think the big lesson for me is my original plans were left in tatters. And so the key is adaptability. Yeah. You have to be able to read, what's going on in front of you, read the market. And of course, you're learning all the time. You're talking, you're networking, you're interacting with other businesses. And I was learning so much, so fast about all of this. And what it meant was, in the end, my business plan completely changed. And my business today is completely different from the one I started.
Did you feel that I'm sure that having held a number of positions in the police service with distinction, you obviously have to have a certain amount of resilience in what you're doing, but was it a different type of resilience you needed entrepreneurial resilience is somewhat different, I think, to organizational resilience. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the resilience you felt you had to show, I guess.
Well, entrepreneurial resilience is a very lonely concept because I was part of an organisation of 53,000 people. I had enormous infrastructure and resources, around me in the Metropolitan Police. Whereas as an entrepreneur, you're on your own, really, particularly in the early days, you set out. And so I think that one of the key lessons I learned was about building a good team. Recognizing your own weaknesses and your own deficiencies, and finding people that can plug those gaps, people you can trust. And some of the people I worked with were former police officers, but a lot of them were from other sectors and other backgrounds, from business and from other corporations. So it's a lonely experience, and you have to be resilient to disappointment, I think. I've often said that resilience and persistence are two vital qualities for an entrepreneur, because if you give up easily, then you're unlikely to be a successful entrepreneur unless you're very lucky. But so you have to be prepared to try different things, learn from your failures and mistakes, and that is just part of that education process. And eventually, even if you start with the wrong idea, you need to start with an idea and pursuing that idea, that business vision that you've got, even if it's the wrong one, and they often are, prove to be. Pursuing it helps you find the right vision, the right answer.
In those early days, then, did you ever think, actually, I'm not sure I'm cut out for this, I might give up and go and do something else? Or did you think, or was it just in the Bob Quick DNA to think, no, sod it, I'm gonna keep going until I get it right?
Well, I would say probably every day for the first 3 years, I thought, I'm not cut out for this. I just don't think I'm commercially minded enough. I'm perhaps just engineering, deals and commercial sort of agreements weren't natural to me, because it was so alien to me in the police. As I've said, you have the resources on tap in large scale. So for the first 3 or 4 years, I just wasn't sure I'd make it, but I was determined to keep going. And I could sense I was making progress. Although I knew I wasn't there yet, I knew after a year, I knew a lot more. And after 2 years, I knew even more than that. And as long as I felt I was making progress, and slowly, I just felt my knowledge was becoming more rounded about, how business operates, how commercially successful organizations work, and, learning some of the secrets of their success, and just listening to people, because people have wonderful stories to tell. And I met so many other entrepreneurs who had such similar experience to me, and they had been knocked down loads of times, picked themselves up, dusted themselves down, and kept going forward, and had huge disappointments on the way, but their persistence paid off. And in the end, I think that's what happened with me. I just kept at it.
Yeah. I wonder if there was a little bit of the 18-year-old Bob Quick, though, from his early beats in Lambeth, who hated it to start with, and then sort of learned that maybe you were maybe subconsciously drawing a little bit on that in starting something completely new there, that you maybe felt that maybe it would come good, or you just felt it was slowly coming, perhaps.
I think I'm a sort of fatal optimist in many respects, and so I just kept going and felt that things were slowly falling into place. And I began to enjoy it, and I began to sort of enjoy it was a roller coaster ride. It was, it was highs and lows all the time. And I think a lot of entrepreneurial types like that. I think I do. Those highs and lows of business, particularly in those early years. The excitement of it at times was great. When you have a success, you win some business, you start a new project, you start working with new people. All those things I found incredibly rewarding, and outweighed the disappointments and failures of those early years.
What about, working in the police service? Obviously you were dealing with your fair share of rogues, if you like, in a sort of policing capacity, but the rogues don't disappear, do they? When you move into sort of entrepreneurial ventures, it's just in a slightly different setting, and, we're not dealing with kind of career criminals, but you're dealing with people who perhaps their word isn't their bond or so on. But did you have to kiss a lot of frogs, if you like? So
absolutely. Frog kissing is, a full-time occupation for an entrepreneur, and I did encounter, people that frankly I misjudged, because I was probably out of my comfort zone and in an environment I wasn't entirely familiar with. it was more difficult for me to separate out people, who didn't necessarily have the integrity that you would expect or want in doing business with. So I had my fingers burnt a few times by dealing with people that proved to be untrustworthy and unreliable. But again, valuable lessons. And even as an experienced former police officer, you can still miss things. You kind of don't see something in someone until it's too late or it's quite late. So yeah, again, I learned to be cautious. I learned to do more due diligence about who am I dealing with here. Who else knows this person? How can I cross-reference what they're telling me? What sort of reputation have they got? Yeah, don't take it's the same thing in policing, really. Don't take things at face value.
Yeah.
So I should have carried that lesson forward more strongly in the early years.
Yeah, I suppose in the police service, so you're dealing with people who, may have broken the law, and it's more overt, if you like, the misdeeds, if you like, whereas they're perhaps a bit more subtle in
Oh, absolutely.
entrepreneurialism. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
What about? I'm just interested in the thing about in the police service. I can imagine that you've obviously got the criminals. If you talk about stakeholders, you've got criminals on one thing, but you also got your team, and I imagine there was a great bonds of trust, if you like, within your teams. And maybe there's something there about when you went into entrepreneurialism about not the team is a looser thing, a looser sort of concept. So maybe there's an issue that you assumed you could trust people and then found out that actually there are some people that you couldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you leave something like public service, you do have different sort of frames of reference and sometimes, different values. And what I suppose one of the shocks to me was the sort of the commerciality of it all. I was still driven by very much an ethos of trying to do good, trying to keep people safe, trying to stop bad things happening, whereas that's all very well, but if it doesn't make any money, you can't really just operate on that alone, unless you're just volunteering, which is fine. But if you're trying to run a business and employ people, and that was very much my aim. The idea of bringing employment to others, to working with others to do some good things that help people, keep people safe, and make a living from it, and pay people's wages from it, and pay taxes, was all part of being a good citizen, really, and that was very appealing. And I've taken enormous pleasure, from that. Over the years, we've employed some fantastic people who may have been with us just for a short-term project, or over many years. So that's been a great journey to go on, and I've worked with so many different people, former police officers, yes, but so many from the commercial world who've taught me an enormous amount.
What would you say? I mean, I want to get on to move the story forward because obviously you talked about BGS, and now you're sitting here talking to me. The listeners can't see it, obviously, but behind you is the logo Global Secure Accreditation. So I want to chart that journey a little bit about they both still exist, but about how GSA emerged. But what would you say though in that stage before GSA came along was your biggest fault as an entrepreneur? I mean, did you have the thing that you got wrong most often, if you like, or maybe a lesson you're still learning every day about being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think one of the things, probably my biggest disadvantage, is probably being over optimistic about things. And actually, I did recognize that. And in 2015, I'd had a new business idea, which we can talk about in a while, about global secure accreditation. But I realized I probably needed someone working with me that had different qualities. And there was someone I worked with in the police service that I knew was quite different to me. I knew we got on, but I knew had very different outlook. And that individual had actually gone into government after their police career. So they had a lot of experience in sort of senior government roles as a senior official. And that person I'd describe was much more skeptical than I am, less trusting, and perhaps more skeptical of whether a business idea will work or not, or whether it's got commercial value. So I found actually that kind of countered it helped put my feet back on the ground, really. So finding people to work with that will level you and tell you some harsh truths about what you're doing is important, whether they're working with you or they're advisors or family members. But making sure you've got people around you that, will challenge you is so important. And that's what happened, in terms of another individual joined the business. And it was at a time when we had just launched Global Secure, and we were really looking at the hotel industry. There'd been a number of pretty catastrophic attacks on hotels around the world. And in fact, at the same time as we launched the business, there'd been a terrible criminal attack on a woman in a London hotel, vicious attack. So it got us thinking about people's safety in hotels. And whilst people are generally quite safe in hotels, there are challenges with that idea, because crime in hotels is quite common, and they can be targets for terrorists, as we know. But they're certainly targets for criminals. And there are criminals, in every country in the world that just make a living out of targeting hotels and people that stay in hotels. And it's not really visible to the traveller. People don't really necessarily know what the crime rate is in a hotel. So it got us thinking about, how do you know that the hotel you've just booked is safe? And the fact is, you don't know. If you go on the website, you'll find out that the hotel has good food, has a 5-star rating for cleanliness, has polite staff and helpful staff, good facilities, whatever. But what you don't know is how seriously they take security and safety, and whether they're any good at it.
Yeah. And on one level, I'm sure everybody as an individual would feel safer knowing that there was a form of accreditation, in hotels in terms of safety and security. But of course, in the commercial world, it's the imperative that the companies perhaps feel when they're sending their people to far-flung parts of the world, I guess, that creates the impetus for hotels to do something about it.
You're absolutely right. In fact, whilst many hotels that we encountered did take security seriously and had good security arrangements in place, there were many that didn't. And it wasn't easy to sell to hotels because they're very competitive businesses. They have to keep a tight rein on costs. So actually what we did was exactly as you've alluded. We switched track really to talk to employers, about their duty of care to their travelling staff. And our research had revealed, huge numbers of quite serious incidents around the world in hotels happening to people on business travel. And so we started that conversation. And in fact, that's moved on enormously. In fact, I was invited onto a working group in the UK run by the British Standards Institute under the umbrella of ISO. And actually a new travel risk management standard was developed, which I was privileged to be able to contribute to. And that's ISO 31030, which now sets the first sort of global benchmark of standards for managing traveller safety. And so that's really taken us a few steps forward, really, in taking travel risks seriously and making sure, proper due diligence is done about all aspects of business travel.
So this business, of course, has now grown in its own right. And, and it's moving towards an exciting phase at the moment. But it's, again, you mentioned roller coasters early. It's been a few ups and downs on this roller coaster. A lot of it was pandemic inspired. So maybe tell the listeners a little bit about the ups and the downs.
Well, this is coming back to resilience and persistence, I think.
Yes.
But I mean, with global secure accreditation, we had a major breakthrough early in 2020 when a global bank decided to adopt our accreditation to ensure their traveller safety. And they basically wrote to about 1,000 hotels globally and said, if you want our business, you should have this accreditation. So this was our big moment, our big breakthrough. And literally, we had hundreds of hotels communicating with us about becoming accredited. And that was 3 weeks before the global lockdown, where
Right.
the travel industry was decimated. Hotels were hugely impacted by the pandemic, as were all aspects of travel. And so the business really nosedived at that point. We had to go into our own sort of business lockdown, if you like, and cut costs, go into survival mode. And actually, they do say adversity is the mother of invention. We had quite a lot of skilled former police officers in our orbit at that time, because the plan was for them to become expert assessors of hotel security. Well, at the time, we saw other opportunities to deploy former officers, and one of those was the government quarantine service, where hotels were housing hundreds of people all over the country. I think about 25,000 people on its peak day were in quarantine, and it was a very complex operation. And so we were approached by government as to whether we might be able to help, and we saw that opportunity because our staff, expert problem solvers. They have good leadership skills. They understand the legal frameworks that are relevant, and they've got great interpersonal skills. So actually, our staff went into the hotels to coordinate all of the operation of the quarantine service, supporting the Department of Health and Social Security, and that proved to be a very successful operation. And so that started as a new direction, with a workforce solution that was very highly skilled, very adaptable, that could be parachuted into a critical or crisis situation to provide support for government departments or organisations at a difficult time. And actually, that proved to be the direction of that part of the business. And since then, we've actually moved into other areas like cyber security or information security and other aspects, as well as the accreditation and travel risk management side.
That's an amazing story because, of course, you've in adversity, you talked about, the mother of invention and so on, but you found a sort of perfect situation there where, okay, there's adversity there, but you looked at the skills that your team had and thought, well, actually, there's a match in other ways. Maybe, as you said, not quite the plan you expected, but something that there would definitely be a good piece of business for you until such a time as the lockdown abated and so on. So obviously that thing has itself abated. So the secure accreditation movement is coming back?
Yes. Now that travel, has pretty much returned to 2019 levels, and corporate travel, has pretty much recovered. It is still recovering. It's not there yet. But now we're engaging with more and more hotels and global organizations who are interested in having the option to send their staff to hotels that have been independently accredited for safety and security. So it's, we're trying to really create a new market there, because historically there's never been an accreditation system for hotels. And all we saw was value for employers in having an independent validation of the safety and security of their accommodation choices as the responsible thing to do and as part of their duty of care. So that's the service we offer, and that's gaining traction.
So you've come a long, long way from Bobby on the beat, 18 years old, long and distinguished career in the police service, and now growing success as an entrepreneur with a team and in a promising growth area. Now, let's think back to the moment we were crossing the Rubicon again. We want to give listeners the confidence they need to succeed. I mean, how much of your positive or negative experiences sort of impacted on your achievements as you look at it? What sort of lessons, if you had to sort of boil it down to 1, 2, or 3, or however many you want, sort of lessons that you've sort of learned along the way, in a nutshell, what would you pass on?
The thing I would pass on is the biggest single thing that's impressed upon me is how many people are out there who are prepared to help you. There are a lot of people that helped me over the last 10 years or more. They've advised me, they've worked with me, they've given me really good insights into the world of business and the commercial world. So there are people out there that will help you, that's for sure, and they're not hard to find. But you have to be resilient. It's a hard world, to make commercial success. We'd all be doing it if it was easy. It isn't easy. You have to accept you're going to have disappointments, you're going to have highs and lows, you're going to have some real hard knocks, and really have to pick yourself up and keep going forward. And you have to be persistent. You have to be prepared to try different things, speak to different people, try different ideas. And this is really how I found my way. Over the years, we've been involved in helping build safe city projects. For example, in Nairobi, after the terror attacks there in 2013 at the shopping mall, we helped the police in Kenya to develop a command and control complex to better manage their policing response to major incidents. So tremendously rewarding things. I never thought I would ever be doing anything like that, but we found our way into that world and have done quite a bit of work in that arena since. So be prepared to try different things and don't take no for an answer. Just keep pushing. But eventually you'll learn to recognize where you are at a dead end and you need to change direction. And I've had lots of those experiences. And have an idea, have a vision, and pursue it. Because even if it's the wrong one, following it, pursuing it will help you find the right answer. And things will take shape, over time, as they did for me.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you, Bob, so much for your time. The journey from the public sector to the entrepreneurial world is not easy. And for me, 3 things stood out. Resilience. Lots of things didn't prepare Bob for the number of knockbacks he got when he had to start all over again in business. But that led to the second, persistence. Bob just kept plugging away with his vision and he just kept going, and it's paying handsome dividends. And mistakes. He had the humility to learn from his mistakes. And I love the phrase he used in that interview about no plan surviving contact with the enemy. So thank you to Bob, and thank you too for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate and review through your usual podcast provider. And if you want to find out more about the Merri-Cast or our business, Merrible Media, you can find us on LinkedIn. Don't forget to join us for our next episode, but until then, thanks for listening.